Dumu, red cliff. A broken spear, sunk in sand, its iron still not rusted. I pick it up, clean it, and remember the old kingdoms. If the east wind had not favored General Chou, that spring 2 wives would have remained imprisoned. So we continue with the poems by Dumu, and the one we're reading today, Red Cliff, I think is very representative of of the style of poetry that is conventionally associated with Dumu. That is to say, a heptasyllabic quatrain with a historical subject matter. Now, this poem is pretty hermetic unless you know a little bit of history of China during the period of the Three Kingdoms. We've already talked a little bit about it, but we will make a short summary so as to make this poem meaningful. So at the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, in the last years of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century of our era, China basically fragmented into 3 big states, and the biggest one, controlling most of the Yellow River Valley and the last of the members of the imperial Han dynasty, was called Wei, and it was ruled by a general called Cao Cao. And it was pretty much the strongest of those states and the one that had probably the most possibilities of becoming a successor to the Han Dynasty. In the west, in the area of modern Sichuan and the territory of the old region of Shu, was Shuhan. This was a state in which the ruler was a collateral member of the imperial Han Dynasty itself, Liu Bei. And his was the weakest and the smallest territory, probably, but he was mythically aided by Zhuge Liang, who became, he was later deified, and he was the exemplar of the great general, the genius, and the worthy prime minister. And we've already encountered poems talking about Zhuge Liang and his ruler Liu Bei in this anthology, and to temples dedicated to their memory. The last and third of the 3 kingdoms was in the southeast. It was the kingdom of Wu, and it was controlled by the Sun family, first Sun Ce and then Sun Qian, and it had its capital in Jiankang. So therefore, in the lower Jiangzi River Valley. So this is the scenario in which we are. This is the period of the 3 kingdoms, which lasted, let's say, approximately from 200 to 250, 260 AD. And it was a period of much infighting, and basically it was characterized by the attempts of the northern and stronger state of Cao Wei to annex the other states. Now, the title of this poem is Red Cliff, or Red Cliffs, and this is an allusion to a famous battle, also called the Battle of Chibi, that took place in 208 AD. So Cao Cao, the northern general, who had the last Han emperor as a semi-captive and who had managed to unify the whole north under his command, was finally making his move to absorb the south. And he had an army that was massive, an enormous fleet that he sent down the Jiangzi, and his intention was to finally crush Shu and later Wu. But those 2 states made an alliance, and they had a battle, the famous Battle of the Red Cliffs, in which, even though outnumbered, they managed to massively defeat the Northern Army, and this victory would give a long lease of life, at least of half a century, to these southern kingdoms. It would also consolidate the division of China, which would continue in the following centuries of disunion until the Shui and the Tang dynasty in the last years of the 6th century of our era. Now, one would imagine that this episode would be seen as a tragedy because of the division of the country, but in traditional Chinese history, even up to almost up to today, Cao Cao's figure has been generally vilified. He became a villain in semi-fictitious accounts of the period of the 3 kingdoms, especially the one represented by the Ming novel romances of the 3 kingdoms, but also in opera and in other historical and literary texts, where he is portrayed as the typical Machiavellian villain who is completely ruthless and unscrupulous and who just wants power. And in those stories, generally the hero is Zhuge Liang and his ruler Liu Bei, and the kingdom of Shuhan is the one that should have continued the Han Mandate. So the Red Cliff appears a lot in Chinese classical literature. It appears in tons of poems. It appears in tons of texts. And here we have indeed Du Mu's take on the topic. So let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet, as usual. And while we're doing that, we will explain a few other details that appear in the couplets. So the topic of this poem is therefore historical. In the poem, Du Mu visits a historical site and thinks about, reminisces about the Battle of the Red Cliffs and the historical events in the Three Kingdoms, which would have taken place like 6 centuries or so before Du Mu's own time, but which would still have been remembered. So the topic of the poem is historical reminiscing, also you could say landscape, because he is in theory visiting the place of the battle. And let's take a look at it. As I said before, the poem is divided into 2 couplets, as all quatrains, and that's a meaningful division here, because the first couplet locates itself strictly in the present, with Du Mu as its protagonist. He is visiting the site of the Red Cliff, and he encounters some memorabilia, some old items from the time of the ancient wars. The second couplet is a jump back to the past, although more than a strict jump to the past, it's more of a hypothetical. It's an open rhetorical question of the style, what would have happened if the victory had not been won? So there is a change between past and present in these couplets. Let's take a look at the first one. A broken spear, sunk in sand, its iron still not rusted. I pick it up, clean it, and remember the old kingdoms. So Du Mu is probably at the site of the battle in the middle course of the Yangtze River Valley, and while looking around, he might find, even 6 centuries after the event, mementos of the battle, and it seems that sunk in the sand, he's found a broken spear. The spear is a ji, which is more a type of halberd, really. That is a very long lance with a cross shaft close to the top, with a pointy part on the horizontal direction as well. It was a very typical weapon in antiquity. So he finds this broken weapon in the sand. Its iron is still not rusted. He picks it up and he cleans it up. Now, this might have actually happened, but it's very easy to make an allegorical or a symbolic interpretation of this lucky find. That is to say, the iron not rusted from the spear could very well represent how the memory of the events that took place at the Battle of the Red Cliffs are still remembered and still very much important in the minds of Tang poets and literati. The fact that Du Mu picks it up and cleans it, he polishes this artifact of the past, again, looks very, very, very easy to be read as a metaphor for Du Mu composing a poem about this historical event in the past, therefore polishing the memory of this event in the past. So, you could make a literal reading of this couplet, but probably you could also make a metaphorical one, like he is washing the dirt, he is bringing to light again those cataclysmic events of the Three Kingdoms through his poetry, through his verse. Second couplet. If the east wind had not favored General Zhou, that spring 2 wives would have remained imprisoned. So here the poet makes a speculation which leads into the past. So the Battle of the Red Cliff was a victory for the Southern Alliance of the states of Shu and Wu. But what would have happened if they had been defeated instead of victorious? Now, this is a quatrain, so there's not that much space to speculate, but Du Mu's speculation is unusual in that he doesn't speculate about big political events that would have followed from the defeat, but rather he just focuses on what is, almost a trivial incident, is that spring 2 wives would have remained in prison. That is, the consequence of the defeat would have been that 2 wives, we will explain later who these 2 wives are, these 2 wives would have been made prisoner and languished under the thraldom of the northern ruler of Cao Cao. Now, what's this about the two wives? So the second couplet says, if the east wind had not favored General Zhou, that spring 2 wives would have remained imprisoned. So let's explain this a little bit. So in the Battle of the Red Cliffs, the supreme commander of the allied Wu and Shu forces was General Zhou, what was his surname? Zhou Yu, I think, yeah. So he has a reputation of being a slightly vain commander. He was the generalissimo of the Wu troops. But he was in a way assisted by the military general in the service of Shu Han, the great Zhuge Liang, of whom we've talked before. In fact, it was said that it was Zhuge Liang who designed the strategy that led to the momentous victory of the Red Cliffs. One of the things he did was, predicting that the wind was going to blow from the east, and taking into account the position of the massive fleet of Cao Cao that outnumbered them, he decided on sending some fire ships upstream in the direction of the enemy ships. And this is what happened, and they were pushed by the eastern wind, and these fire ships wreaked havoc on Cao Cao's fleet and contributed very greatly to the victory. But what would have happened, says the poet, if the eastern wind had not favored General Zhou, if the fire ships had not weakened the enemy's fleet so much as to allow for a southern victory? 2 wives would have remained imprisoned. So these 2 wives are the Qiao sisters, in the original called the 2 Qiaos. And they were the wives of the old ruler of the state of Wu, Sun Ce, the father of the ruler at the time of the Battle of the Red Cliffs, Sun Quan, and the wife of General Zhou himself. So there were 2 sisters, 2 wives of important members of the Wu family, and they of the Wu ruling group, and they had a reputation for being very beautiful. I'm not sure if at the time that Du Fu composed this poem, Cao Cao had already a reputation for lechery. Probably he was already being typeset as the villain in the confrontation. So I think it's perhaps one of Du Mu's innovations to paint, as a consequence of this battle, that the evil ruler of the north would have snatched these 2 ladies for himself. In fact, the 4th line actually mentions, so the other translations I have consulted are pretty different from this one. And for example, the last line is translated in one of them as, the brass bird would have locked up the 2 Qiaos. Another translation that I have here, the bronze Paro tower deep into spring would have held 2 lovely ladies. So the brass bird, or the bronze sparrow, is a reference to a building that was built under the instructions of Cao Cao in his capital of Jie. And it was a magnificent terrace with some pavilions on top and lots of buildings. It was built in 210, so it was built actually after the events of the Battle of the Red Cliff. And it was, you could say, the crowning achievement in construction and public works of Cao Cao, and it would remain an important building during all of the period of disunion. And during some of those years, Ye was the capital of some northern state or other, and when it was, this bronze sparrow terrace was, refurbished and improved and built on. But in the end, well, when unification came, the city of Ye and the brass bird terrace were completely obliterated by the Shui dynasty. So they act as a metaphor of sorts for the whole period of disunion. And they also act, these structures, this bronze sparrow, this brass bird, it acts as a metaphor for Cao Cao. As Cao Cao had this building built and had some rituals decreed to be held in his honor in the building after his passing away. So after Du Mu and during succeeding dynasties, some legends arose based probably on this poem, actually. Although I am not an expert to know about this, but I know that much later, during the Yuan dynasty, for example, and even more clearly in the Ming dynasty with the romance of the Three Kingdoms, perhaps based on this poem, the fictitious story arose that when Zhuge Liang met with General Zhou Yu to try to convince him to unite forces and resist the northern advance of Cao Cao, the legend says that one of the arguments that Zhuge Liang used to persuade the general of Wu to join him was a poem allegedly composed at the founding of, or at the construction of this bronze bird terrace, a poem that Cao Cao's son, Cao Shi, had composed called Ascending the Terrace. This poem is real. It's a real poem composed by Cao Shi that has been preserved. But according to the legend, as it appears in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the very intelligent, smart, and savvy minister, that is Zhuge Liang, modified a couple of lines. He gave an altered version of the poem to Zhou Yu, which said something like Cao Cao was going to, one of the reasons for his building the tower was to kidnap those two Qiao ladies, the beautiful ladies of Wu, and make them his concubines in the palace. So the falsified lines proving Cao Cao's lecherous intentions would have been he would have the two Qiaos, these beautiful ladies of Wu, that he might rejoice with them morning and evening. And as a result, the legend says the enraged Zhou Yu vows to go to war with Cao Cao, allies with Zhuge Liang's forces, and defeats him in the battle of the Red Cliffs in 2008. Now, again, as I said, this is a legend, and we know it's notoriously false. First of all, it doesn't appear in the contemporary documents. Second, the Battle of the Red Cliffs was in 208. The construction of the Bronze Bird Terrace was 2 years later, in 210. But, in many ways it has become, fiction is sometimes more seductive than reality, and it has become, accepted as even better than the reality. And that gives another layer at the reading of this poem, as many people reading Red Cliff through the prism of all that later literature about the Three Kingdoms would read this last couplet: if the east wind had not favored General Zhou, that spring 2 wives would have remained imprisoned. They read this, obviously, in line with those myths, but probably this poem, indirectly, was the starter of those later mythical versions. Now, this is a translation by Geoffrey Waters, and it translates the last line in a rather weird way, because it says, the 2 wives would have remained imprisoned, which seems to imply that the wives were being kept as hostages before the battle, and that they were somehow released because of the battle. Other versions of the poem, other translations that I've read, clearly state the opposite, and I think they're probably more precise. So, for example, there's this version that I found on the internet, which translates the poem as such. Red Cliffs. The broken halberd lies buried in the sand, but the iron has not yet rusted. I polish and wash it, recognizing that it is from a previous dynasty. If the east wind did not assist Master Zhou, the brass bird would have locked up the 2 Qiaos. I think this poem, I wouldn't discuss which of the 2 versions is better, but I feel that the second one, it reads more hermetically because it includes more of the original historical references that appear in Du Mu's original poem. But I think it actually helps to understand it better once you check those references. Another version. This is from a book I have at home, translation of Du Mu's poetry. The poem reads similarly. It reads like this: the Red Cliff battleground. Broken halberds in the sandbanks, their iron still intact. I pick one up and brush it off, thinking of former dynasties. And what if Commander Zhou hadn't had that lucky wind from the east? The bronze sparrow tower, deep into spring, would have held 2 lovely ladies. And that's all for today. I've been longer than usual, but as you have probably seen, this poem does require a lot of commentary to aid in the interpretation.